Hi everyone. For your first set of readings, I've chosen the topic of optics, and what I mean by that is how we look at things. Both of these stories are literally about that, but at the same time, each of the stories is told in kind of an interesting way. In other words, they play with point of view in an interesting way, so that you as the reader are sort of invited to decide how you want to look at the events that the writers are talking about. First of all, there's Fitzjames O'Brien's The Diamond Lens. Fitzjames O'Brien was a writer born in Ireland who became a U.S. citizen and then died in the Civil War. And he wrote a number of stories in the general area of science fiction, horror, and fantasy. In this particular story, he's dealing with microscopes and what we might see at the subatomic level. Or at least the microscopic level. And he throws in a lot of names in microscopy, these are actual historical figures, people like Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who invented a microscope and was one of the first people to understand that there are, in fact, life forms so small that we can't see them with the naked eye. The story is interesting in a couple of other ways. One is that in addition to its scientific premise of subatomic life, it also has sort of a supernatural premise relating to the seance or the psychic insights. And so this is kind of unusual for later science fiction, where usually a writer would more likely limit himself to one premise. But O'Brien has the two here. One thing that's really startling for a modern reader is the racism that you see in the story. And this is sort of, in this case, I would say in many cases when we're reading older literature, as you probably already know, we're going to encounter some old-fashioned attitudes that aren't always very comfortable. But what's interesting in this particular case is that the main character's anti-Semitism is kind of part of the point of view. In other words, it's part of why we realize before long that he's not necessarily a particularly nice person. And so that, as you'll see in the course of the story, pays off in him doing more and more outrageous things. So, a story about how we see things at the small level, and also how this character with a kind of a warped point of view sees life. The other story is by Ambrose Bierce, an American writer, and he's a much more sophisticated writer, and one thing that he's done that's really interesting in this story is to divide it into sections, and each section is sort of a different way for us to see the events. For example, one section is the diary of a person who has already died. And so we see these different short sections, and we kind of put them together like a jigsaw puzzle to form our own theory of what really happened. Ultimately, the story doesn't quite spell out for you which characters are telling the truth and what might really have happened. But if you read carefully and maybe reread it, you'll be able to see, or at least have your own opinions about what happened. The story itself relates to very interesting ideas in physics and discoveries that, for example, there is a large spectrum of light, and that our eyes only see a small portion of it, the visible spectrum of light. And there are, of course, X-rays and infrared radiation and so forth that we don't directly see. So Bierce is playing with that idea. He actually got this idea from a different story by Fitzjames O'Brien. I haven't included that one here for you because I wanted to show you two different writers with different approaches. But Bierce is kind of doing a take on a story of O'Brien's called What Was It? And he was one of many writers to do invisible monster stories because these ideas in physics were so exciting. Later on, H.G. Wells did a similar story called The Invisible Man, which was a big hit and was turned into a movie. And then the writer H.P. Lovecraft, who we'll see later in the semester on other topics, also played with this idea of invisible life forms that we can't see because of our own limited apparatus for seeing.